Every day, you make thousands of decisions: what to say, what to try, what to avoid. But what if many of those decisions are not driven by logic, not by intelligence, but by a silent fear operating deep inside your brain? Fear of failure doesn't scream, it whispers. It convinces smart people to play small, talented people to hesitate, and capable minds to choose safety over growth. In this documentary, we explore how the psychology of fear quietly controls human behavior and how your brain decides long before you're aware of it. Chapter 1. The invisible fear. Fear is usually imagined as something obvious: a fast heartbeat, sweaty palms, a clear sense of danger. But the most powerful fears rarely feel dramatic. They feel reasonable. Fear of failure does not arrive as panic. It arrives as hesitation, as overthinking, as the quiet decision to wait a little longer. Every day, people walk away from opportunities not because they lack ability, but because something inside them says, "This might not end well." That voice feels logical, protective, even intelligent. But psychology tells us something important. Fear of failure often operates below awareness. Most people don't say, "I'm afraid to fail." Instead, they say, "I'm not ready yet. It's not the right time. I should be realistic." From the outside, these sound like smart decisions. From the inside, they feel safe. And that's exactly why fear of failure is so powerful. Imagine a simple situation. Someone considers applying for a better job. They meet most of the requirements, they have the skills, but they hesitate, not because they know they will fail, but because they might. Their mind quickly begins to calculate risk. What if they're rejected? What if they feel embarrassed? What if it proves they're not good enough? So, instead of acting, they delay. They stay where they are, and the brain relaxes. Psychologically, this relief is important. Avoidance reduces discomfort in the short term, and the brain learns from that. It learns that not trying equals safety. Fear of failure often hides behind productivity. People research endlessly, prepare excessively, plan without executing. On the surface, it looks like responsibility. Underneath, it is fear managing behavior. Human behavior researchers call this protective decision-making, choices designed not to succeed, but to avoid emotional pain. The brain is not asking, "What will help me grow?" It is asking, "What will protect me right now?" And failure, in the brain's language, is not just an outcome. It is a threat to identity. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. For most of human history, mistakes were costly. Being rejected by the group could mean danger. Being seen as incompetent could mean exclusion. Even today, the brain reacts to social failure as if survival is at risk. That's why fear of failure feels personal. It doesn't feel like an event. It feels like a statement about who we are. Not "I failed," but "I am a failure." This subtle shift is what gives fear its control. Psychologists describe fear of failure as a future-based emotion. It doesn't come from what is happening now. It comes from imagined outcomes. The brain runs simulations: embarrassment, disappointment, judgment, and even though none of these have happened yet, the emotional response feels real. So, the body reacts, the mind pulls back, the decision changes. Without realizing it, people begin organizing their lives around avoiding that imagined pain. They choose familiar paths, predictable routines, lower-risk versions of themselves, not because they lack ambition, but because fear quietly edits their choices. The most important thing to understand is this: fear of failure does not stop people by force. It stops them by agreement. It offers safety, comfort, certainty, and in exchange, it asks for growth to be postponed. Over time, this pattern becomes invisible. People forget they are choosing fear. They believe they are choosing logic. But psychology shows us that many of our rational decisions are emotional at their core. Fear doesn't need to shout. It only needs to feel reasonable. In the next chapter, we will move deeper into the brain itself. We'll explore how fear of failure is processed neurologically, why the brain treats failure like danger, and how these reactions shape decisions long before we become aware of them. Because to understand human behavior, we must first understand how the brain learns what to fear. Chapter 2, where fear begins in the brain. To understand fear of failure, we have to move away from motivation and mindset and look directly at the brain. Because fear does not begin as a thought, it begins as a biological response. Long before you consciously decide to hesitate, avoid, or delay, your brain has already evaluated the situation and reached a conclusion. This process happens quietly, automatically, and extremely fast. At the center of this system is a small, almond-shaped structure deep in the brain called the amygdala. The amygdala's primary job is not to make you successful. Its job is to keep you safe. It constantly scans your environment for potential threats, not just physical danger, but emotional and social risk as well. Rejection, embarrassment, public failure. To the amygdala, these experiences are not abstract ideas. They are signals of danger. When the brain detects a possible threat, the amygdala activates before conscious thinking even begins. It sends an alert through the nervous system. Stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline are released. The body prepares for action or avoidance. This happens in milliseconds. By the time you think, maybe I shouldn't do this, your body has already reacted. This is why fear of failure feels physical. Tight chest, shallow breathing, mental fog. The brain is preparing you not to fail, but to withdraw. Now let's look at the other side of the system. The prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain responsible for logic, planning, and decision-making. It helps you analyze risk, weigh outcomes, and think long-term. In theory, this part of the brain should be in charge. But under stress, it often isn't. When the amygdala senses threat, it can temporarily reduce activity in the prefrontal cortex. This means clear thinking becomes harder. Psychologists call this an emotional override. The brain prioritizes protection over growth. Instead of asking, what is the best decision, the brain asks, what is the safest decision? And safety, in this context, usually means not trying. This explains something many people find confusing. Why do intelligent, capable people make decisions that go against their own long-term goals? Because intelligence lives in the prefrontal cortex. Fear lives deeper, and in moments of perceived risk, fear often wins. The brain is not designed to maximize potential. It is designed to minimize danger. Another important concept is prediction. The human brain is a prediction machine. It constantly tries to anticipate what will happen next based on past experience. If you have failed before, or even watched others fail, your brain stores that information. The next time you face a similar situation, the brain predicts pain. Even if the circumstances are different, even if you've grown, the brain prefers familiar outcomes over uncertain ones. Known discomfort feels safer than unknown possibility. This is why fear of failure becomes stronger over time if it is never challenged. Each avoided risk reinforces the brain's belief that avoidance equals survival. Brain imaging studies show that the anticipation of failure can activate the same neural pathways as actual pain. In other words, imagine failure hurts. The brain does not clearly distinguish between real and predicted emotional pain. This is why people often say, I know it's irrational, but I can't stop feeling this way. They're not weak. Their brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Social failure is especially powerful. Humans are social beings. For most of history, belonging meant survival. As a result, the brain treats social judgment as a serious threat. Being laughed at, being rejected, being seen as incompetent. These experiences activate fear circuits just as strongly as physical danger. That's why fear of failure often intensifies when others are watching. A presentation, an interview, a public attempt. The brain equates visibility with vulnerability. There is also a concept in neuroscience called loss aversion. The brain reacts more strongly to potential losses than to potential gains. The pain of losing feels more intense than the pleasure of winning. So, when faced with a decision, the brain focuses on what could go wrong, not what could go right. Failure feels heavier than success feels exciting. This bias silently shapes decisions. People don't avoid action because they don't want success. They avoid action because they want to avoid loss. Over time, this creates a pattern. The brain learns that avoiding risk reduces stress. Stress reduction feels rewarding, and the cycle repeats. This is how fear of failure becomes automatic. Not dramatic, not obvious, but deeply ingrained. The brain is not trying to sabotage you, it is trying to protect you using outdated survival rules. Rules designed for physical danger, not modern goals. Understanding this changes the conversation. Fear of failure is not a personal flaw. It is a neurological response shaped by evolution, experience, and learning. And the good news is this: what the brain learns, it can also relearn. But before that can happen, we need to understand where these fear patterns come from in the first place. In the next chapter, we will explore how childhood experiences, education, and early feedback shape fear of failure, and how the brain builds long-lasting fear loops that follow us into adulthood. Chapter 3: Childhood, Learning, and the Fear Loop. Fear of failure does not suddenly appear in adulthood. It is learned slowly, quietly, and repeatedly. The human brain is not born fearing mistakes. It learns what to fear through experience. From early childhood, the brain begins building associations. What leads to approval? What leads to discomfort? What should be avoided? Every reaction from the environment becomes information. A raised voice, a disappointed look, a comparison to others. None of these need to be extreme to leave an impact. The brain is especially sensitive during childhood because it is still wiring itself. Neural pathways are formed based on repetition, not intention. What happens often becomes what feels normal. Consider a simple learning moment. A child answers a question incorrectly in class. The room becomes quiet, someone laughs, the teacher moves on. No punishment occurs, no harm is done, but the brain records the emotional signal. Mistakes equal discomfort, visibility equals risk. Over time, the brain learns a rule: avoid situations where mistakes can be seen. This rule is not conscious, it becomes automatic. Psychologists call this process conditioning. The brain links a behavior with an emotional outcome. Praise teaches approach, criticism teaches avoidance. In many educational and social systems, success is rewarded more visibly than effort. Mistakes are highlighted more than learning. The brain adapts to this environment. It learns that being right is safer than being curious, that perfection is safer than exploration. Another important factor is identity formation. Children do not just learn what they did wrong. They often learn what that mistake says about who they are. Instead of thinking, "I made a mistake," the brain moves toward, "I am bad at this." This shift is subtle but powerful. Failure becomes personal. Once failure is tied to identity, fear becomes stronger, because avoiding failure now feels like protecting the self. Parental expectations also play a role. Even well-intentioned pressure can shape fear. Phrases like, "You can do better," "You're so smart," "Don't waste it," "Others are ahead of you." These messages are often meant to motivate. But to a developing brain, they can signal something else. Approval is conditional. Worth is linked to performance. The child learns that failure risks disappointment, not just outcomes. Over time, the brain begins to develop what psychologists call a fear loop. The loop works like this: attempt gives mistake, gives emotional discomfort, discomfort gives avoidance, avoidance gives temporary relief, relief gives reinforcement of fear. The brain remembers the relief more than the missed opportunity. This is important. Relief is rewarding. Each time fear leads to avoidance, the brain strengthens that pathway. This is how fear of failure becomes habitual. School environments often unintentionally reinforce this loop. Grades, rankings, public comparison. These systems focus on results, not process. The brain learns that being evaluated is risky, so it begins to associate learning with stress. Trying something new becomes threatening. Staying within known limits feels safe. This conditioning does not disappear after school ends. It follows people into adulthood. By the time someone reaches adult life, the fear is no longer linked to classrooms or parents. It shows up in different forms. Not speaking up in meetings, not sharing creative ideas, not applying for opportunities. The situations change. The brain's response remains the same. The fear loop continues, often unnoticed. Importantly, not everyone develops fear of failure in the same way. Some environments encourage curiosity over perfection. Some caregivers normalize mistakes. In these cases, the brain learns a different rule. Mistakes are information, not danger. But when fear-based learning dominates early experiences, the brain adapts accordingly. It does not question the rule, it follows it. This explains why telling someone to just be confident rarely works. Fear of failure is not a mindset issue. It is a learned emotional response. The brain is responding to patterns it has seen before, and it will continue responding the same way until those patterns change. The good news is that fear loops are not permanent. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change, remains active throughout life. But before fear can be unlearned, it must be understood. In the next chapter, we will explore how fear of failure directly shapes everyday decisions, how it influences what we choose, what we avoid, and why the brain often prioritizes short-term comfort over long-term growth. That is where fear quietly takes control of human behavior. Chapter 4. The Fear-Decision Connection. Every decision you make carries two possible directions. One moves toward growth, the other moves toward comfort. Fear of failure is what often decides which direction feels safer. But this choice rarely feels emotional. It feels rational. From a psychological perspective, decision-making is not a purely logical process. It is a balance between emotion and reasoning. When fear enters the equation, that balance shifts. The brain does not ask, "What decision will help me in the long run?" It asks, "What decision will reduce discomfort right now?" And fear of failure provides a very clear answer: avoid risk. One of the strongest forces behind this process is loss aversion. Loss aversion means the brain experiences potential loss more intensely than potential gain. The idea of failing feels heavier than the idea of succeeding feels rewarding. So, when faced with a choice, trying something new or staying with the familiar, the brain focuses on what could go wrong. Even if the odds of success are high, this bias does not mean people are pessimistic. It means their brains are protective. Consider a common situation. Someone thinks about changing careers. The new path is more meaningful. It aligns with their interests. But it also contains uncertainty. The brain quickly lists potential losses: loss of stability, loss of status, loss of confidence if it doesn't work. Even if these losses are imagined, the emotional response is real. So the decision becomes framed around avoidance rather than opportunity. Staying feels safer even if it leads to long-term dissatisfaction. Fear of failure also narrows attention. Under fear, the brain focuses on immediate outcomes. Long-term benefits fade into the background. Psychologists refer to this as short-term bias. When fear is active, the brain prioritizes immediate emotional relief over future rewards. That is why people delay important actions. Not because they don't care, but because acting feels emotionally expensive. Another important concept is decision fatigue. When fear is present, decisions require more mental effort. The brain becomes overloaded with what-if scenarios. What if I fail? What if I regret it? What if others judge me? This mental noise drains energy. Eventually, the brain chooses the easiest option, not the best one. Avoidance becomes the default. Fear of failure also influences how options are perceived. Two choices may objectively have similar risk, but fear changes perception. One option feels dangerous, the other feels neutral. This is not because the risks are different. because one option threatens identity. Failing publicly, being evaluated, being wrong. These threats trigger deeper fear circuits, so the brain marks those options as unsafe. This is why fear-based decisions often feel final. Once the brain labels something as dangerous, it becomes difficult to reconsider. People say, "That's just not for me. I'm not that kind of person. It wouldn't work anyway." These statements sound like self-knowledge, but often, they are fear-based conclusions. The brain is closing the door to reduce uncertainty. Over time, fear-driven decisions shape behavior patterns. People begin to choose paths that minimize exposure. They select roles where expectations are clear. They avoid environments where evaluation is frequent. They limit their range of action. From the outside, this can look like preference. From the inside, it is protection. The most important thing to understand is this: fear does not remove choices, it filters them. Options that feel emotionally risky quietly eliminated before conscious reasoning begins. People believe they are choosing freely, but the brain has already narrowed the field. This is how fear of failure gains influence over life direction, not through one dramatic moment, but through thousands of small decisions. Each one slightly safer than the last, each one slightly further from potential. In the next chapter, we will explore how fear of failure often disguises itself as perfectionism, how the need to get everything right can quietly prevent action altogether, and why waiting for certainty often becomes another way of avoiding growth. Chapter 5: Perfectionism and Paralysis at First Glance. Perfectionism does not look like fear. It looks like high standards, responsibility, discipline, but psychology shows that perfectionism is often fear of failure wearing a different face. It is not driven by the desire to do well, it is driven by the need to avoid doing badly. Perfectionism begins with a simple belief: if I do everything perfectly, I can avoid failure. This belief feels logical, but it creates an impossible condition because perfection does not exist. The brain, however, treats this belief as a protective strategy. So, instead of encouraging action, perfectionism raises the threshold for starting. Everything must be ready. Everything must be controlled. Every possible mistake must be eliminated, and as the conditions increase, action is delayed. Psychologists describe this as avoidance through preparation. The person appears busy, productive, focused, but underneath, the brain is postponing exposure to risk. Planning feels safe. Research feels safe. Refining feels safe. Action feels dangerous. This is where paralysis begins. The more important the task feels, the more pressure is attached to it, and the more pressure there is, the stronger the fear response becomes. The brain begins to associate the task with threat, so it looks for reasons to delay. Not now, not yet, not until it's better. Perfectionism also distorts expectations. Instead of seeing effort as a process, the brain sees performance as a test. Each attempt becomes a judgment. If it goes well, relief is temporary. If it goes poorly, the emotional cost feels high. So, the brain concludes that it is safer not to try at all. No attempt means no failure. This explains a common pattern. People with high potential often struggle the most with perfectionism. They are aware of what good looks like. They imagine the best possible outcome, and anything less than that feels unacceptable. So, instead of producing something imperfect, they produce nothing. The brain chooses silence over exposure. Another psychological factor is all or nothing thinking. Perfectionism divides outcomes into two categories: success or failure, right or wrong, perfect or unacceptable. There is no middle ground. This creates intense pressure. If the outcome is not perfect, it is experienced as failure even if progress was made. The brain becomes less tolerant of mistakes. Fear increases. Perfectionism also affects time perception. Tasks feel larger than they are. Mistakes feel more permanent than they are. The brain magnifies consequences. What if this defines me? What if I ruin everything? These thoughts are not predictions. they are fear signals. But the brain treats them seriously. Over time, perfectionism becomes exhausting. Constant self-monitoring, endless correction, fear of exposure. The mind is never at rest, and yet, very little forward movement happens. This creates frustration, guilt, and self-doubt. Ironically, the fear of failure begins to produce the very outcomes it was meant to prevent. Psychology research shows that perfectionism is linked not to higher performance, but to increased anxiety and avoidance. The brain spends more energy on error prevention than on learning. Growth slows. Confidence erodes. The most important insight is this: perfectionism is not a strength problem. It is a safety strategy. The brain believes that being flawless will protect identity. But in reality, it restricts experience. It reduces learning, and it keeps fear in control. In the next chapter, we will explore another powerful dimension of fear of failure: the fear of judgment, rejection, and social evaluation. Because for the human brain, failure feels even more dangerous when others are watching. Chapter 6: Social Fear and the Need for Approval. For the human brain, failure becomes far more powerful when it is witnessed by others. A mistake made alone feels manageable. A mistake made in public feels threatening. This difference is not cultural or personal, it is biological. Human beings evolved as social creatures. For most of history, survival depended on belonging to a group. Rejection was not just emotional, it was dangerous. And although modern life no longer depends on tribes for survival, the brain still carries those ancient rules. At the center of social fear is the brain's need for approval. Approval signals safety, disapproval signals risk. From an early age, the brain learns to monitor how others respond. A smile, a nod, silence, disapproval. These signals become powerful feedback systems. Over time, the brain begins to associate acceptance with worth. When fear of failure is combined with fear of judgment, the emotional impact multiplies. Failure no longer feels like an internal experience, it feels like exposure. Being seen, being evaluated, being remembered. The brain treats these moments as threats to social standing, so it responds with caution. Neuroscience research shows that social rejection activates the same neural regions as physical pain. The brain does not interpret embarrassment as a mild inconvenience, it interprets it as harm. This explains why the fear of public failure can feel overwhelming even when the stakes are low. A comment in a meeting, a post shared online, an idea expressed aloud, the brain reacts as if something important is on the line. This is why people often say, "I'm fine doing this privately, but not in front of others." Visibility increases vulnerability. When others are watching, the fear response intensifies. The amygdala becomes more active, stress hormones rise. The prefrontal cortex struggles to stay engaged. Thinking becomes harder, words disappear, confidence fades. Social fear also encourages self-monitoring. The brain constantly checks: how do I look? How do I sound? What are they thinking? This internal surveillance consumes mental energy. Instead of focusing on the task, attention turns inward. Psychologists call this evaluation anxiety. The person is no longer present, they are performing. The need for approval also shapes decision-making long before action occurs. People begin to anticipate reactions. What will they say if this fails? How will I explain myself? Will I look foolish? These imagined responses feel real, and because the brain is trying to protect social status, it chooses caution. Avoidance becomes a way to preserve image. Social media has intensified this process. Visibility is constant. Comparison is unavoidable. Success and failure appear public, permanent, and measurable. The brain interprets this environment as high risk. So fear increases. People hesitate to share, to create, to express, not because they lack ideas, but because exposure feels unsafe. Another important factor is social comparison. The brain naturally compares performance to others. When comparison dominates, failure feels magnified. People stop measuring progress by growth and start measuring it by ranking. This creates pressure. If others seem ahead, attempting something new feels risky. The brain concludes that it is safer not to compete at all. Over time, the need for approval can reshape identity. People begin to ask, what will be accepted, instead of what feels meaningful. Behavior becomes externally guided. Choices are made to maintain approval, not to pursue growth. Fear becomes the invisible guide. This does not mean people want attention. It means their brains are wired to avoid social harm. Fear of failure, when combined with fear of judgment, creates a powerful restraint. It keeps people within acceptable boundaries, quiet, predictable, safe, but the cost is subtle. When approval becomes the goal, authenticity fades. Creativity narrows, risk-taking disappears, and life becomes organized around avoiding discomfort rather than pursuing possibility. In the next chapter, we will explore how fear of failure shows up in real-life paths, careers, creativity, and major life decisions. Chapter 7: Fear in Careers, Creativity, and Life Choices. Fear of failure becomes most visible when it shapes the direction of a person's life. Not in dramatic moments, but in quiet decisions made over many years. What career to pursue? Which ideas to share? What kind of life feels reasonable? These choices often feel personal, but psychology shows they are deeply influenced by fear. In careers, fear of failure often appears as playing it safe. People stay in roles they have outgrown. They delay applying for better opportunities. They choose stability over fulfillment, not because they lack ambition, but because failure feels costly. The brain focuses on what could be lost: reputation, income, sense of competence. Even when the current situation is unsatisfying, it feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. Career decisions are rarely made in isolation. They involve evaluation, interviews, performance reviews, competition. Each of these situations triggers the fear system. The brain anticipates judgment, so it encourages caution. Don't risk it. Don't stand out. Don't fail publicly. This leads many people to remain invisible rather than vulnerable. Creativity is especially sensitive to fear of failure. Creative work is personal. It reflects identity. Sharing it feels like exposure. So fear becomes louder. What if it's not good enough? What if it's ignored? What if it's criticized? The brain interprets these outcomes as threats. So ideas stay hidden. Projects remain unfinished. Expression is postponed. Many talented people experience this pattern. They have ability, they have insight, but they wait for confidence to appear. Psychology shows that confidence usually comes after action, not before. But fear reverses the order. It demands certainty first, and certainty never arrives. Fear of failure also influences major life choices, relationships, relocation, personal goals. People ask themselves, what if this doesn't work? What if I regret it? What if I'm wrong? These questions feel responsible. But when fear dominates, they prevent exploration. The brain favors known discomfort over unknown possibility, even when the unknown holds potential for growth. Another important factor is identity consistency. The brain prefers decisions that align with its existing self-image. Trying something new risks disrupting that image. Failure could mean redefining who you are. This feels threatening. So people choose paths that reinforce familiar identities even if they feel limiting. I'm not that kind of person. That's not for someone like me. These statements feel final, but they are often fear-based boundaries. Fear also shapes how people interpret setbacks. A single rejection becomes a sign to stop. A small failure becomes a signal to retreat. The brain uses these moments as confirmation. This is dangerous. This is not safe. Instead of seeing setbacks as information, fear turns them into warnings. So progress slows. Over time, fear-based decisions accumulate. Each choice seems small, but together, they create a life defined by avoidance. Not dramatic avoidance, but subtle limitation, less risk, less visibility, less growth. People don't feel controlled by fear, they feel practical. But psychology reveals the pattern underneath. The cost of this pattern is not immediate, it appears later. In questions like, what if I had tried? Why did I stop myself? Who could I have become? Regret is often not about failure, it is about never attempting. The most important insight is this: fear of failure does not eliminate potential. It redirects it. It pushes people towards safer paths, quieter choices, and smaller risks. Not because they lack courage, but because their brains are prioritizing protection. In the next chapter, we will explore the long-term cost of avoidance, how fear-based living affects satisfaction, stress, and mental well-being, and why avoiding failure today often creates regret tomorrow. Chapter 8. The cost of avoidance. Avoidance feels harmless in the moment. It reduces tension, it quiets anxiety, it brings relief. But psychology shows that this relief comes at a long-term cost. Fear of failure does not disappear when we avoid it, it grows. Each time the brain chooses avoidance, it learns something important. It learns that the situation was dangerous, and that avoidance was the correct response. This learning strengthens fear pathways. Neuroscientists call this negative reinforcement. The fear is rewarded because discomfort decreases. The brain remembers the relief, not the opportunity that was lost. Over time, avoidance becomes automatic. The brain begins to predict threat earlier and earlier. Opportunities that once felt manageable now feel overwhelming. The comfort zone shrinks. What started as caution becomes limitation. Avoidance also affects emotional well-being. People often describe a vague sense of dissatisfaction, not unhappiness, but unfulfillment. A feeling of being capable of more. This emotional tension builds slowly. Because nothing wrong is happening, it is difficult to name, but something is missing. Psychologists link long-term avoidance to increased stress and anxiety. When the brain constantly scans for threat, it remains in a heightened state. The nervous system does not fully relax. Even without obvious danger, the body stays alert. This creates mental fatigue. Avoidance also impacts self-trust. Each time someone avoids a challenge, the brain receives a message: I cannot handle this. Over time, confidence erodes. Not because ability decreases, but because experience does. The brain has fewer examples of resilience. So fear feels justified. Another hidden cost is regret. Regret is not always about failure. It is often about inaction. Psychological studies show that people regret missed opportunities more than mistakes, especially as time passes. Failure fades. What lingers is the question of what could have been. Avoidance also narrows identity. People define themselves by what they don't do. I'm not someone who takes risks. I'm not creative. I'm not good at that. These beliefs feel stable, but they are built on fear-based behavior. The brain uses past avoidance to predict future limits. The cost of avoidance is cumulative. Each small decision reinforces the next. The brain becomes more certain that safety lies in restriction. Life becomes predictable but smaller, and potential remains unused. Importantly, avoidance does not bring peace. It brings temporary relief followed by long-term discomfort. The brain cannot grow in safety alone. Growth requires exposure. And exposure is what fear tries to prevent. The most important insight is this: avoidance solves emotional discomfort in the short term, but creates emotional weight in the long term. Fear of failure feels protective, but over time, it becomes restrictive. In the next chapter, we will explore how fear of failure can be reframed in the brain, how awareness, perspective, and learning can reduce fear's influence, and how the brain can begin to associate challenge with safety rather than threat. Chapter 9. Reframing failure in the brain. Fear of failure feels permanent because it feels automatic. But neuroscience tells us something important. The brain is not fixed, it is adaptable. The same brain that learned to fear failure can also learn a different response. This process begins not with confidence, but with awareness. The first step in reframing fear is recognizing how the brain labels experiences. The brain does not experience failure as neutral information. It labels it as threat, but this label is learned, not objective. The brain assigns meaning based on past patterns. When failure has been associated with pain, rejection, or loss of worth, the brain responds defensively. To change this response, the meaning must change. Psychologists refer to this process as cognitive reappraisal. Cognitive reappraisal means changing how an experience is interpreted, not the experience itself. Failure can be refrained from, "This proves something about me," to "This gives me information." This shift is small but powerful. Because the brain reacts to meaning, not facts. Brain imaging studies show that when people consciously reinterpret stressful events, activity in the prefrontal cortex increases. This part of the brain helps regulate emotional responses. At the same time, activity in the amygdala decreases. Fear softens. The brain learns that the situation is not dangerous. Another important concept is exposure. Avoidance strengthens fear, exposure weakens it. But exposure does not mean overwhelming the brain. It means gradual contact with uncertainty in a controlled way. Small risks, small attempts, small failures. Each one sends a new signal. I survive this. The brain updates its predictions. This is how fear begins to lose authority. Not through positive thinking, but through evidence. The brain learns by experience. Each time failure does not lead to catastrophe, the fear response weakens. Reframing failure also involves separating outcome from identity. Failure is something that happens. It is not something you are. This distinction sounds simple, but it is neurologically significant. When failure is tied to identity, fear increases. When failure is treated as an event, the brain becomes more flexible. Psychologists call this an externalized perspective. Instead of internalizing outcomes, the brain learns to observe them. What happened? What can I adjust? This reduces emotional intensity. Learning becomes possible. Another powerful reframe involves time. The brain often treats failure as permanent. But most failures are temporary and context-specific. Reminding the brain of this reduces threat perception. What feels defining now often becomes insignificant later. The brain can learn to hold this perspective. Research on growth-oriented thinking shows that people who view failure as part of learning experience less fear and more resilience. This is not about forcing optimism, it is about understanding how skills develop. Learning is non-linear. Mistakes are expected. The brain becomes safer when it knows this. Self-compassion also plays a role. The brain responds differently to failure when it is not followed by harsh self-judgment. Self-criticism increases stress hormones. Self-compassion activates calming systems. This is not weakness, it is regulation. A regulated brain learns better. Importantly, reframing does not mean seeking failure. It means removing fear's authority over behavior. Failure becomes state, not danger. The brain shifts from protection to adaptation. Over time, new neural pathways form. Fear responses weaken. Confidence becomes grounded in experience, not avoidance. This is neuroplasticity in action. The most important insight is this: fear of failure is not eliminated by avoiding risk. It is reduced by changing the brain's relationship with risk. And that relationship is shaped through understanding, experience, and perspective. In the final chapter, we will bring everything together, exploring how awareness of fear changes daily decisions, how to live intentionally rather than reactively, and how to move forward without eliminating fear, but without being controlled by it. Chapter 10: Living Beyond Fear. Fear of failure does not disappear when we understand it, but understanding changes its power. Throughout this documentary, we have seen how fear operates quietly, through the brain, through learning, through decisions, and through avoidance. Fear does not announce itself. It guides behavior from the background. And once this becomes visible, something important shifts. Living beyond fear does not mean becoming fearless. Fear is a natural part of the human nervous system. It exists to protect. The problem is not fear itself, it is when fear becomes the primary decision maker. When fear decides what is possible, life becomes narrow. When awareness returns to the center, choice expands. The first change is subtle. It is noticing hesitation, noticing delay, noticing the moment when logic turns into protection. Instead of asking, "Is this the safest option?" the question becomes, "Is this fear, or is this wisdom?" That single pause creates space, and in that space, the brain can choose differently. Living beyond fear means learning to tolerate discomfort, not eliminate it but coexist with it. Growth always includes uncertainty. The brain must learn that discomfort is not danger. This learning does not happen through thought alone, it happens through experience. Small actions, small risks, repeated exposure. Each one sends a message to the nervous system. This is uncomfortable but survivable. Over time, the brain updates its predictions. What once felt threatening feels manageable. What once felt impossible feels approachable. This is not confidence as personality, it is confidence as evidence. The brain trusts what it has lived through. Another important shift is redefining success. Success is not the absence of failure. It is the willingness to engage, to try, to learn, to adjust. When success is defined this way, fear loses leverage. Failure no longer ends the story, it becomes part of it. Living beyond fear also means allowing identity to evolve. Fear keeps identity rigid. I am this, I am not that, but human behavior is flexible. Identity is shaped by action. Each choice expands the sense of self. The brain learns new boundaries. Importantly, this process does not require dramatic change. It requires consistency. Fear does not control life in one moment. It controls life through patterns, and patterns change through repetition. Small, intentional decisions matter more than bold gestures. Living beyond fear also means accepting imperfection. The brain must learn that being human includes error. Mistakes do not define worth, they reflect participation. This understanding calms the nervous system. When the brain feels safe, it becomes curious. When it becomes curious, growth resumes. As fear loosens its grip, something else appears: clarity. Decisions feel less reactive. Choices feel more aligned. Life begins to feel intentional rather than defensive. Not perfect, but authentic. The most important insight is this: fear of failure does not vanish when we overcome it. It fades when it no longer controls our choices, when awareness leads, when learning replaces avoidance, when the brain learns that growth is safe enough. This documentary is not an instruction to change who you are. It is an invitation to observe how fear shapes behavior. Because once fear is seen clearly, it loses its invisibility. And what no longer hides, no longer controls, fear will always whisper. But you get to decide whether it holds the pen. End of documentary. If this exploration of psychology, human behavior, and the human mind helped you see fear differently, consider staying curious, reflecting often, and continuing the conversation. Understanding the mind is the first step toward living with intention. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more psychology and human behavior content.